David Goodwin, the Assistant Director at the Fordham University Center on Religion and Culture. Many thanks for joining us for our second episode of our new series, CRC Chats. Last October, we hosted a panel exploring the Star Wars universe. Since we all need distractions from the current COVID-19 pandemic, we thought it'd be fun to invite back our guests from last year to talk about the Rise of Skywalker, the Mandalorian, and other happenings in a galaxy far, far away. We'll also have a surprise later on in the night. Joining us this evening is Dr. Kathryn Reklis, Associate Professor of Theology at Fordham University. Kathryn writes about television and film for the Christian Century. Joining us as well is Jack Jenkins, national reporter for Religion News Service. Jack's first book, American Prophets, will be released this April. Many thanks to Kathryn and Jack for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks. It's great to be here.
So the last question during our panel in October was, what did you predict from The Rise of Skywalker after we watched the trailer? So how did the film measure up?
Right. Okay. I disliked it almost entirely, through and through. I saw it with my 9-year-old, now 10-year-old son. He really loved it. I had to see it twice in the theater in a 5-day span because of that. So, second viewing, there are like a little few nuggets, like a few scenes or gems I could raise up as really loving. I was thinking back on our conversation and the things we predicted and the things that we hoped. And my own feeling, like all the things I predicted and hoped, were utterly disappointed in this film. And I felt that, like, actually my other panelists, their predictions were also disappointed, but I'll let them speak for themselves. I mean, my central desire for The Rise of Skywalker, the one thing, I really didn't know where they would go, but the one thing I wanted more than anything was Rey not to have famous parents. Mm-hmm. And there are really no words for like how disappointing I am that they went there and then that they went to Palpatine and I have so many other things. So that my gut reaction is just that alone. Why Rey and the famous parents? I hope we can get into like all the problems around why Rey has famous parents, why Palpatine, how it actually changes the entire arc of the 9 movies in a deeply disappointing way. And I have lots to say on that, but I'll let Jack have his first reaction and then we can go from there.
It's the same reaction, which is that I was disappointed. I think what was so astounding to me is that it was so spectacularly disappointing. And I mean that more in the literal sense. It was like a spectacular, it was like there was 5 films that they shoved into one film. And there was like one of the 5 films was actually like somewhat watchable and I thought would be interesting if you stretched it out. But like, it's so buried under all of these different layers that, similarly to you, my predictions, which included also hoping that Rey came from no distinguished parentage, was a disappointment. The hope that it would kind of come back to this vulnerability. There absolutely were parts of vulnerability in this movie, but kind of the arc that I was hoping they would lead with, which is kind of like developing this imperfect family along the way. There were elements of that, but they actually ended up fraying the family along, like as they did so, to the point where it was confusing as to like who was connected to who. And I mean, like I remember walking out of the theater and just like still trying to process all that had happened, and like I really kind of think through like, does that mean this is like what happens next? Is this like, is the universe over? There's just so many question marks, and not in a way that like, I love thinking about a movie, months and weeks after the fact because it makes you think about something. It was just like, not all of it made sense, and some of it didn't make sense in bad ways. And so there was still there was still clearly an appreciation for Star Wars embedded in the film. It's very clear that the filmmaker, J.J. Abrams, and the actors and the writers did like love Star Wars. It's just one of those things where it became, my lingering question was whether or not they should have been the ones that were handed the opportunity to conclude a 9 film arc. And so, yeah, I also have a lot of permutations and breakdowns within there, but I'll wait for the questions to dig in.
I think both your disappointments about Rey's lineage, we should maybe explore a little further, because Kathryn wrote about this in her article, her review of the film for the Christian Century, and she mentioned it, and you mentioned this. What might have been a more plausible or more acceptable alternative to Rey being a Palpatine, and a weird possible grandchild, clone grandchild, we're never really certain, of the Emperor.
So I mean, so for speaking for myself, and one, I hope Jim, maybe Jim will join us or not, but he, in talking with Jim after the film or hearing some of his reactions, he mentioned, right, just the point that we don't know Rey's parentage, but it raises all kinds of questions about the potential violence or sexual violence behind her lineage, like where and how Palpatine was procreating. But aside from that question, I think for me, two major things stood out. One, if you watch the original trilogy, the original three from this, 70s, early 80s, it's Luke's story, right? And you're watching his coming of age. And then, of course, later we get the prequels. And you start to realize that actually this whole arc is being shifted to be about Anakin, right? It's Anakin's story and Anakin's rise to darkness. And then Luke becomes almost an appendage to Anakin's story. But one of the things that was the most disappointing about not just making Rey a famous, related to the famous original characters, but making Rey a Palpatine, is that by the end then, you're like, this whole 9-episode movies is about Palpatine? It is like Palpatine's story. It is about his, which is actually, I think, in effect, I don't think that's what J.J. Abrams meant to do. But in effect, when I think about showing these movies to my daughter, who hasn't watched them yet because she's too young, but she will be ready soon, and she has all 9 arc, like the character whose story holds it together, the character who's like oscillating in and out of the power struggle is Palpatine. Like, he becomes the center of the story, and that is like a horrifying side effect of this decision. And then I think that the decision, I honestly just think they thought, well, it's too obvious if we make her a Skywalker, so we've got to do something else. So we'll make her a Palpatine in this weird way, but then she'll be a spiritual Skywalker. We can come back to that. But it also just, I think, completely destroyed the idea that the Force, both good and evil, right, sort of moves outside of lineages and aristocracy. And actually, Jack, you made this point in our last panel, right? Like, the whole point is that you can defeat evil one time in someone like Palpatine, and then it will rise again, right? And good rises again, and it overcomes or it doesn't overcome. Like, there's this like never-ending struggle. But actually, this movie was like, no, there's no never-ending struggle. It's all Palpatine. Like, it's just Palpatine all the time. You're like, no, it's so much more interesting if there's a new evil and we don't know where it is. I don't even care. I don't need a deep mythology. It's like, of course there's a new evil. There'll always be a new evil. And there'll always be a new good. And Rey can be that good from like the junk heaps of the universe. We don't need an aristocratic line. So those were my initial thoughts. I could keep going. I'm going to stop.
So I will only add on top of that, which is that I will say there is a piece of information that has since come out in the novelization of The Rise of Skywalker, which is that apparently Palpatine's son was not. Palpatine's son was a failed clone of him, and thus the lineage for Rey comes from a failed clone and his life.
Not liking it more. I'm not liking it more, but
so, no. Because it redeems it. Also, you like the fact that they had to like release a novelization to correct. I mean, there's just like a lot of questions. In addition to that, what, and I agree, and I hadn't really heard it put that way, and I really like that it becomes about Palpatine. What becomes really frustrating about that is that he's a completely flat character. Like, he's just always evil. Like, there's no complex, like Anakin, you see this rise of this like enslaved child who like loses his mother and has complicated feelings, and then like the Jedi Order arguably kind of fails him, and then like he becomes like this monstrous figure, and like you get to like understand him as his like Palpatine's just like evil guy, right? Like, just no matter what, since the first appearance, he's been like trying to work absolute power into the equation for himself. And that's not complex. It makes evil into something that just exists in the ether, and is one-dimensional, whereas both good and quasi-evil are far more complex in the Star Wars universe. Now, I will say that I was okay initially with the idea that Palpatine would still be in the movie. I thought there was still like a way of doing that would have been interesting or complex. For instance, it would have been interesting if like since he had that great conversation with Anakin in like the prequels, where he kind of talks about the idea of bringing someone back from the dead. It would have been really interesting and dark if Palpatine, in a good way, if Palpatine had apparently known all along how to do that, but it kept it from Anakin so that he could keep Anakin within his own clutches, and then he only saved it for himself following his death. And like the true dark sideness of him was him being able to make good on that thing he had talked about in the prequels, and it might actually even having that direct connection would have been interesting. And it seems like it wasn't, like, if that's what was happening in the Rise of Skywalker, it didn't seem a very direct connection. It was just weird. And with Rey, I mean, like, I gave The Last Jedi a hard time because I felt like it had kind of played fast and loose with the Star Wars universe, and now I feel like I love that film by comparison. And what it did, what I always felt it did right, was talk about the Force as this democratized thing, like that multiple people have access to the Force. Some people were just, some people have to work harder to get to it, or like that sort of thing. And Rey could have been this really interesting character in that, like, she came from nothing, but her Force power wasn't tied to the lineage. And that could be, if you remember, like, Luke Skywalker was this humble kid from the middle of nowhere. But because he was Darth Vader's son, like, that's what made it, and that was shocking because we didn't think that was the case. I think it could have been really interesting parallel for it to be shocking that they were not of that ilk, that they were outside of that family, and then all of us could read ourselves into Rey. But I just think that the film missed a really interesting opportunity.
Agreed.
I'm going to inject an editorial comment here about Palpatine as well. As from a storytelling perspective, to me, it didn't make any sense because there was no hint of him in the previous two films, and then he's revealed in the screen crawl at the beginning. It seemed like lazy storytelling to me just to throw him in there.
Yes.
As the big baddie.
Yes, definitely.
And I'm convinced that they wrote themselves into a corner, and that was what the trick they tried to get themselves out. But
yeah.
So we were discussing about Palpatine and the Emperor. For better or for worse, he was the main antagonist of the film. But we also saw more about the Sith, which I found interesting. I don't know if you did or if you didn't, but what might this portrayal of Palpatine and the Sith tell us about the Star Wars cosmology or the religious underpinnings that the previous films did not?
Do you want to take that one, Jack? Do you want to start it off?
I think what's interesting, it certainly complicates the concept of the Sith, right? Like the Sith become something that they have a planet out in the hinterlands, right? And there's certainly sort of some quasi-religious, imagery of what we see of all these people in hoods in the last epic battle, which, for the record, if they're all Force-sensitive Sith and they all just died instantly, there's like a lot of questions about like why that was the case. But that's interesting. I do think that's interesting in the grand sense that the Sith are like this people and this force that like has existed on the fringes of the universe and apparently had never fully been extinguished. And when you do a bunch of nerdy research like I did, and you like certain lines that Palpatine has in the movie when he says like, "I'm all the Sith," and he kind of talks about what the Sith are, all of this stuff gets lost in the movie. You don't grasp the complexity of what he's saying, and they don't do an adequate job of explaining it, is that would require them not jumping all over the place every 3 seconds to do it. But underneath that, there is this interesting concept of the Sith as this more complex society that has really kind of lived out in the darkness, and it complicates, because we always see Sith as basically two people at any given time, right? Like it's Darth Maul and Palpatine, and later it's Anakin and Palpatine. And so for it to suddenly be outside of the rule of two, as they refer to it, the master and the apprentice, no more, no less, that there's suddenly like dozens of them with hoods and their statues, and they have really weird throne rooms. You know, that would be an interesting thing to explore. I think theoretically you could have done a lot of stuff to like explain where Snoke came from. And instead of him just being like apparently like a weak Force sensitive clone that that they had like weird copies of in like, you know, on this Sith planet. Side note, it's weird that like apparently you can produce a person who's so Force sensitive he can like beat people up from far away, but you wouldn't just produce an army of them. Like I just like they're just none of this making sense. But with that in mind, like I do think in the same way we talked about this a little bit in our last session where we talked about kind of these Force almost godlike creatures that show up in the series the Clone Wars, and they also show up in the series of Rebels, which for the record is a fantastic series. I was super impressed by Rebels, and like in the same way they seem to add some complexity to, you know, almost the light side of the Force and the Force itself. I did appreciate the effort to complexify the Sith. I just don't think it was particularly well executed.
Yep, I basically agree. I mean, I remember thinking the first time I saw it when Rey is walking through the Sith temple, whatever planet, and then we see Kylo running through it again too, and thinking, oh, here's like a whole world of mythology that could be explored, and it's just the backdrop for this sad showdown of familial drama, like just like a tiny generational drama, and all of this like epic like history that's clearly thousands of years, alluding to thousands of years of history and culture and religion, is being reduced down to like a family struggle between two bloodlines, in a way that seemed like very sad and very limited, and it's just backdrop to that. I would also say that I saw the movie the second time with my sister-in-law, who's a huge fan of the original three, but really doesn't care that much about anything else that's come out. And she was, you know, I mean, they don't use the word Sith in the first three movies. Like, it's not a concept original to the mythology. It's built out of the prequels, and then it's built later. But even Darth Vader is not referred to as a Sith or a Sith Lord in the original three movies. And so this kind of dualistic, kind of creating this dual Lucas starts to play within the prequels, like, and seeing like there's a lot, I think, as Jack said, so much that's interesting about that could be done. But in the limited scope of a movie like this, it's also kind of becomes really flat, and it makes evil and good into such dichotomized forces. And I think everything that Jack said about Palpatine, right, is just the epitome of that. It's just this flatly evil character. And it doesn't even reference, right, the possibility that the Sith, if you're going to go that way, right, might in fact be a much more complicated cultural and religious system than just pure evil.
Yeah, agreed.
So I think I know the answer to the next question, but do you feel Rise of Skywalker provided a sense of closure for this 9-piece story arc, or do you think it just seemed as if this series was cobbled together in a really crude fashion?
It didn't provide one that I found satisfying. I think that like The Last Jedi will be the last movie of that arc of the story for me. Like, it will be the one I want to stop with. And that doesn't mean like I'll never let my children watch Rise of Skywalker or something like that. I've watched the Clone Wars more times than I can say. I mean, the movie The Clone Wars, because it's my son's favorite movie. So you never know, right? Parenting is self-abnegation all the way down. But I think for me, it wasn't satisfying. I can see, to me, it really, I mean, and I know we're going to talk about Mandalorian later. To me, it just said, oh, okay, thank God this is over. Like, I'm done. Like, I don't ever want to think about Palpatine again. And honestly, if like the Skywalkers are tied up in this nonsense, like, I don't want to think about the Skywalkers again. Like, let's move on to the more interesting corners of the universe. Let's pick random, strange, minor characters. Let's follow those stories. Like, I am done with this weird psychodrama between Palpatines and Skywalkers. So it makes me more eager for like side spin-off stories, and just in that sense, yes, it's done. Thank God it's done. But it didn't feel like a great closure. Like, whoa, that was a really satisfying resolution to this arc, at least for me.
Yeah, I agree in that. Like, if the goal of Disney was to make me feel like this arc was completed, they failed. If their goal was like this stealthy effort to get me to feel super done with the Skywalker saga, but still want more Star Wars and watch and buy their other stuff, then mission accomplished. Because like it very much like, I was like, well, I don't like, if this is where this story has gone, I don't care about a lot of these characters anymore, because they've made it put them in such weird places. I had this meta theory. I did a whole Twitter thread once that Jim and I are actually talked about like what I felt like could have been a better base for the movie that kind of was built around like Rey's random healing power that came out of nowhere, except for that it has some precedent in the Mandalorian television show now. But I felt like that could have been a really interesting concept to play with. She has this really, like on the good side of the Force, on the light side of the Force, like this is a healing power that she has, and Palpatine actually has been hoarding this sort of like really dark power that can like revive someone from the dead, but it requires like such great like sacrifice in a really kind of awful way. And that, you have someone like Kylo who has killed his father and kind of like is starting to really wrestle with regret. And then you have his grandfather, Anakin Skywalker, who would have literally killed and did to like retain the power to bring someone back to life. And so there could have been this like amazing way of talking about how loss has permeated so much of the Star Wars universe in a familial context, like that loss and doing without and the potential for loss has been a driver for both good and bad things throughout this whole Skywalker saga. And that Rey suddenly stumbling upon this power to give life back to those who were healed, and and Palpatine stumbling upon in the dark way, and Kylo left in the center just frustrated and unhappy because he can't bring his father back, right? Like he can't undo the things that he's done, but he didn't do any of that. So like, so that's ironically, I feel like we're wrestling with that more in the spin-off series like The Mandalorian. So, I don't feel like, I didn't feel satisfied with this ending. I also feel similarly that I'm like, insofar as one has what's called a head canon, like the canon in your own brain for the Skywalker saga, for me, it also ends with The Last Jedi. It has a great more finality to it anyway. So I'm going to move forward with that kind of as, you can't erase something from the canon, but in my heart, I feel like that was the last film that really took the series seriously in a way that I appreciate.
You both mentioned The Mandalorian, so I feel as if this is a good time to transition to that series. When we met in October, Mandalorian had not been released. Since then, it's a hit with fans, it's a hit with critics. Why do you think people are connecting with the show?
You mean other than Baby Yoda?
Well, we can get to Baby Yoda as well.
I mean, I think it's just, it's like both, it's this perfect combination of deep mythology, and so for super fans, right, it has all of these deep references into the mythology, but it does great episodic television. It does the thing great episodic television does, which is, right, it drops you into the universe, it slowly builds out the characters, but each episode is also like, especially after the first two get going, right, each episode is the Mandalorian on an adventure, right? The Mandalorian challenge, tackling a challenge, overcoming an obstacle, meeting a new planet. So that you don't also have to be a super fan or a super geek about Star Wars mythology to like just enjoy the way the episode holds together, and they build on each other. And I think, I mean, also like that the mystery, right, of the masked or the sort of covered hero, this allure of Mandalorian culture and religion, which is I think actually developed, compared, like, speaking of Jack's point, to like the Sith, which is like, seems like it is very carefully being developed, right? It's not being heavy-handedly like, here's everything you need to know about the Mandalorians. It's like dropping you in, like, no, you're not going to know everything, because it's a secretive culture, it's a secretive religion, but it's deep and rich, right? It has many rituals and practices. We will probably never fully understand everything that goes into it, but each time we learn something new about it, like, it seems substantial and meaningful. And so I think there's this both mystery and revealing. I think his character arc is so compelling, right? This orphan who suffered great trauma, maybe to all of Jack's points, right? This loss, this trauma, and then being adopted into this culture and sort of fully taking it on. And yet you can't help as a viewer be like, is that, like, is he going to ever feel tension with that? Like, are we ever going to know his home culture? Like, how deep does that go? I just think it's so compelling for all of those reasons.
Yeah, and just to build off of that, I think what's interesting about it is that it's kind of, you know, it does tell a collective arc over the course of the show, but there also is kind of like an old episodic monster of the week element to it, where like it'll just like have a whole episode that's more kind of like gangsters in a heist mission, and like that's actually really fun and entertaining, and you can just watch The Mandalorian and be entertained with what's happening in front of you. It's a really cool character with a really cute character, Baby Yoda, standing next to him, and like that's entertaining on its own. And yet it is also clearly like, you know, a feast for Star Wars nerds. Like, it does a whole lot of work to include references to other groups. I mean, the whole mythology around the Mandalorian to begin with is interesting to Star Wars nerds because we have seen them in the television shows where they had this very specific proud culture. They were the great rivals of the Jedi for quite some time, arguably even as much as the Sith. Because they fought wars, et cetera, but this new iteration of the Mandalorian culture that we see in The Mandalorian is actually not one we've seen before. We don't totally understand why they're living underground. We don't totally understand why they don't remove their helmets, because they definitely used to. And so, and of course, all of it's evocative of Boba and Jango Fett. And so you have like the Star Wars nerds can like really sink their teeth into this and be like, oh, it's a little reference like even you know in the opening episode when they're talking about the deal, when he gets the deal to go try to track down Baby Yoda, one of the characters that walks in, he's very subtly on his sleeve is the symbol of the cloners from Camino, who of course were the ones who created the clone army to begin with. And so like we have all these questions. Like, it's really kind of good in that kind of 21st century television way, in which if you screenshot a moment, you can unpack all the different pieces of it. Even the device that he uses to give him the Mandalorian steel in like the second or third episode is actually a throwback to a character that runs through the screen for just a second in The Empire Strikes Back, who's carrying what everyone assumed was an ice cream maker.
That's right.
But they managed to make it into like a pivotal prop in this new show. So it kind of has something for everyone in that regard. And I really don't want to undersell this. I genuinely think that Baby Yoda is a big factor for why so many people love this show. They managed to, in the same way that BB-8 was like good at like making this iconic droid figure. So too, is that Jim?
Jim. Oh,
I'm so sorry. Can you see me?
No,
you cannot.
At the bottom.
Oh,
I got the time all
there
wrong.
he is.
Damn!
I'm really sorry.
That's
I
all
thought
right.
it was at 5. I was just checking in. And then I realized, oh no, I'm 45 minutes late rather than.
So for our audience members, our special guest is Jim McDermott, SJ. He is a Jesuit priest and a contributor to America Magazine. And you are based out of Los Angeles, correct?
I am, yeah. For the moment,
And
yes.
you're under self-quarantine as well, or self-isolation, as we all are?
Absolutely, yeah. Like, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, good. I live with 25 other guys in a big Jesuit community, and I have barely left my room at all in 10 days. Like, I've left to make myself some dinner or something, but otherwise, or to take a walk, but that's it. So yeah, I'm taking it really seriously, actually. How are you guys? How are you doing? I'm so sorry. I'm coming.
That's all right. Don't worry about it.
You've had this conversation already, I bet.
No. So we were talking about the Mandalorian.
Oh no, I was about to say you're about to jump in at Baby Yoda.
Oh yeah, sure. I'm
So what
all
are your
in for
thoughts of
Baby
the
Yoda.
Mandalorian?
my thoughts are it like saved my Christmas because I disliked Rise of Skywalker so much that it was like, okay, there's a whole other Star Wars that's really sort of creative and sort of easy. It's simple. Like I loved The Mandalorian because it's a really simple storyline, and yet each episode was filled with Star Wars, like interesting characters and exciting adventures. Yeah, I loved it. Absolutely loved it. How about you guys? Did you like it?
Oh, I loved it. Yeah.
So, do you know, I was just thinking too about this. The thing I think I also loved about it, when you think about the whole arc of Star Wars and all the little moments that I hope that they'll make shows like The Mandalorian, I think, oh, I really hope this won't be the only one. Is that it is the moment of Empire's demise, and you're like, right, so the Empire's over, and the Republic's trying to get started again, and so like the clones, there's these cloners, but they're all underground, right? We know what's coming with the newer movies, right? Force Awakens, right? But we're way far from that, and you think, what is it like? I mean, how do you dismantle an empire? How do you get people moving from empire back to republic? Like, what changes on the ground? And then watch The Mandalorian going to these different societies and meeting characters in this hugely transitional moment. And it's not the main plot, right? And you think that's exactly right. Like, these things are not, there's nothing totalizing about this. It's piecemeal. Some people are still living like they're under the empire, right? Mm-hmm. In some places, soldiers and right, these like old troopers still have power. In other places, they'd been living off the grid so long it didn't really matter who was in power. And that to me is so fascinating, right? This little moment of these shifts where you think, you know, like we imagine, how does an empire rise, but then also what is it like after an empire falls? Like, how do you start to imagine normal life after that? And I love that it's just dropping us into these little moments with everyone sort of nervous and uncertain. Are they being spied on still? Is it really true? Like, who's in charge? Who's trustworthy? What is this new way of being together going to look like?
Mm-hmm. So we began our discussion with Rise of Skywalker. Jim, what were your thoughts on the film?
I don't want to be I had trouble with it, and probably anyone who watched the other conversation that the four of us had would not be surprised by that. I just found it. Here's the thing, and it kind of weird, in a weird way, it relates to the moment we're living in now. I've been reading the book, and I thought maybe it would help, and it has not helped. It's actually been kind of brutal. And the thing I'm noticing in reading the book is that the whole story is focused on Rey, really. Like, everyone else is somewhat peripheral. Like, they get to move in and out, but there's no other story going on. It's all about Rey. And you want to say Rey and Ben, sure, but really everything's about Rey's identity. And that, I can see how you might come at, if you watched all the Star Wars movies, you might think that makes sense, but like the Jedi thing, but it's not. Like, Star Wars is all about how everybody is somebody. Everyone has an interesting story in Star Wars, which is what makes The Mandalorian so cool. Like, you're following The Mandalorian and Baby Yoda, but there are so many other characters you could stop and have a whole season about. Like, that's what Star Wars does, is it somehow the magic of it is that every character almost immediately is like a really fascinating and sort of interesting sort of person that you just want to follow, right? That's what Rose Tycho was, for me anyway, in Last Jedi. She was an example of that. And in a sense, the thesis of Last Jedi, when you get to the end, is like, yeah, everyone's connected to the Force too. That's how much everybody is somebody. Everyone has an ability to really affect everything. But then suddenly in Rise of Skywalker, it's like turning that on its head, which I think I don't think it worked. Like, I think that the more that they leaned into Rey, the more they kind of screwed up the magic of her, like giving her a last name and that being kind of what was important to her. It felt like something that someone had put on her rather than what was organic to her story. And it also just, it ruined a bunch of other characters. Like, for me, the whole Rose Tycho thing was a real problem. Like, you can't create an interesting character like that and then say, like, she's off stage the whole movie. And you create a new character, Jana, I don't remember Jana's last name, but who's also super interesting, but has almost the same story as Rose, and is also a woman of color. It's like, that's creepy and wrong. Like, that's not right. It just on all kinds of other, beyond the world of the story levels. And somebody like J.J. Abrams and Disney, they knew that. It's very hard to see how they ended up. I hope someday they make a making of this movie where we get to find out, like, how did they come up with this as kind of the way to put the pieces together. But anyway, just to, like, not to rant on and on, but for me, the biggest problem is that Star Wars should always be about how everybody is interesting and important. And I felt like in the end, they decided, not really though, it's really Rey that's interesting and important, and the Skywalker legacy. And that, I found that disappointing and just sort of hard to sit with. Yeah.
Agreed.
I'm sure you guys had already said the same thing.
No, beautiful, beautiful points.
So I think the main takeaway of tonight's discussion is Rise of Skywalker, major disappointment, Mandalorian, a pleasant surprise. That sound right?
I mean, my son and I have been saying, what we need now in our self-quarantining life is just release the second season of The Mandalorian. That's what the nation needs. That is what the nation needs.
I think that's right. Is it shot? Is it all been shot?
I have no idea.
They announced Rosario Dawson will be a character from the Clone Wars, is it?
She's going to play Ahsoka Tano.
I think so, right? Yeah.
I'm so excited about this.
I can't believe it.
Amazing.
So,
like, if you're not familiar with Ahsoka, like, she's one of the coolest side characters and complicates the entire Jedi narrative, and that she is no longer a Jedi. That because she left the Order, she's actually this incredibly important person in Anakin Skywalker's life, that has existed outside the movies. So to see her in live action is great, and for her to be Rosario Dawson is going to be amazing. I'm also sure that, like, Cory Booker, she's been dating, is hanging out hardcore because he's a giant sci-fi nerd too. But it's like stuff here. This is fascinating.
So before we say farewell, Jack, you have a book coming out. Could you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, well, it's I mentioned Cory Booker, so it's relevant. I have a book called American Prophets. It's the subheading is the religious roots of progressive politics and the ongoing fight for the soul of the country. It has to do with progressive faith communities and their role in the pushing policy and pushing political campaigns over the last 15 and 20 years. Their role in public life has often been underplayed both by conservatives and even their fellow progressives quite often. But it turns out they've actually played a key role in any number of legislative fights over the last few years, including the Affordable Care Act and some of the major protest movements both right before and during Trump's presidency, whether that's Standing Rock or Ferguson and Charlottesville, the opposition to white supremacy in those places. Or the immigrant rights movement and the opposition to the family separation policy. These faith groups have played a key role in all of them. So it's tracing that history and telling a story that too often goes ignored or untold.
That sounds fascinating. When's the release date again?
April 21st. You can pre-order it now. It's American Prophets is the title of the film from Harper One. The title of the film. Oh, wouldn't that be great? My own Star Wars film. Yeah, I wanted to say.
And Jim and Kathryn, are you working on anything in particular now that our audience might be interested in?
So far, so very far afield from Star Wars. So hard to say. A book I just edited is just come out called Protestant Aesthetics and the Arts. And it actually sort of asks the question, so, lots of people talk about there being such a thing as the Catholic imagination, or a kind of Catholic aesthetic tradition. And this is a book of essays by a lot of different scholars and writers, asking the sort of, is there a Protestant imagination? And it goes back to early Protestants all the way through Black Protestant, Korean Protestant, contemporary traditions. So that just came out, and it's full of amazing essays by a lot of really smart, awesome people, published by Rutledge Press. So it's more of an academic-y book. And I'm working on stuff about religion and literature, a kind of history, a kind of cultural history of the idea of religion and literature. Like when people put them together and say religion is like literature or literature is like religion, what are they trying to say?
Interesting. Jim?
Yeah, and for me, so I think in March, there was supposed to be an article in America that I had written about spirituality and architecture, looking at 3 different retreat houses. I have no idea when that will be published now, probably like a year from now. But you can keep your eyes open. Otherwise, the thing I'm doing most right now, other than some screenwriting stuff that's, takes forever, is 2 little things. Like I say Mass right now every Sunday online on my Facebook page. So if you're looking for a place to hear Mass, to be present at a Mass. And I have this newsletter. It's hard to call it a newsletter. It's called Little Spiritual Exercises. It's on Substack. And every day it's just like a 2 or 3 sentence thing you might do to just sort of like decompress or help kind of process the stuff that we're all living through. So yeah, those are the kinds of things I'm kind of playing around with right now.
My wife said to tell you she's been reading your newsletter every day.
Oh, wow, that's great. Oh, thanks.
I'm reading it and I'm really loving it.
Oh, I'm so glad. I thought it might be too much, but I'm trying to make them really short, and I'm really glad that I hope they help.
Well, I'm going to subscribe now. Apparently.
Well, and I have 2 new books to read. I can't wait.
Well, we have time, so so the final question for the night, and we're asking this of everyone who comes on CRC Chats, is what is one thing that's helping you cope or get through the coronavirus pandemic we're all dealing with right now?
So I'm stuck at home in an 800 square foot apartment, 2 college professors teaching 5 online classes, between homeschooling 2 children, kindergarten and 4th grade. So we do a lot of coloring, a lot of wrestling and tickle fights to survive. And then actually 2 shows that I've been watching, my husband and I have been watching. I actually just wrote a review of them for the Christian Century. I probably a month ago would never have ever watched them. The Circle and Love is Blind, both on Netflix, both reality TV shows that in their own ways are eerily about like building intimacy and deep relationships without ever having access to the other person's physical embodied reality. I mean, The Circle is like a bunch of people stuck in like isolated apartments who can only communicate over social media. And I swear a month ago, I was like, this is a sign of society's decline. And now I'm like, oh my God, peeps, this is so true. This is the heart of love. Like, I find it so moving. I've cried so many times. Like, wow. So I've been watching both of those.
Wow. Well, I will say that, in addition to walks, I have been reading a lot. I'm actually, one of the books I'm reading is a Star Wars book. I've also definitely, I don't know if you're aware, they're releasing now a new and final season of the Clone Wars television show every Friday. A new episode comes out. So I've been kind of keeping an eye on that. But I will admit, I have crossed the Rubicon, and I am watching Star Trek now. I know. There's the division, but the new Picard show from CBS is actually like pretty excellent.
Yeah. And
the quality of the filmmaking and the way it's filmed is actually like significantly different from previous Star Trek entries. And so, among the myriad of things that I'm reading and that aren't science fiction and stuff like that, I have definitely maintained a love for those sorts of things while in quarantine. So
that's Jack. That's so funny you say that, because I was like, does that seem like the kind of thing to say? Like, I've been watching Picard too, and I watched the Star Trek shows growing up, but I never really resonated with them. In fact, I think probably at our public thing, I made fun of Star Trek. But I have to say that Picard is an excellent show, and it's also made me go back and watch a lot of not Deep Space Nine, The Next Generation and Voyager, and be like, wow, this was amazing. How did I not realize how great some of this was at the time?
Yeah, same. Same thing.
I think for me too, like, so I think what's helping me is, it's kind of different at different times, is sort of thinking of this like being on a retreat a little bit, like in the sense of like, I have a lot of time to myself, almost all my time to myself, and and on a retreat, like that's kind of a time when like you're not on social media very much, you're not in that kind of communication very much, which is different. The communication thing is more important now than ever, I think, but being away from, like, a fast from some things that I would normally do that in this period of time I'm not. And personally, I find the more I think of it like that, the more balanced I can be. Like, social media or the news is just a nightmare, and it should be a nightmare. We're in a very serious situation, but there's a way in which it just doesn't. I know that. I get it. I'm living in my room. I know that things are serious. So I don't need to know more than that. I don't need to know how much worse it is between now and 3 hours from now. And I find that every time I plug in for very long, it just makes me very anxious, and that's not, like, it's unnecessary. Like, we just sort of live with this and wait it out, you know? And so that's what I'm trying to do, is think like a retreat, think like breathing more. I should be exercising more, like yoga or something, but just sort of trying to be present in the moment, and less sort of what's tomorrow look like, what is a week look like. Yeah, that's what I'm trying to do.
Before we say farewell, any final thoughts from anyone?
Well, I just want to say I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Oh,
I'm so sorry that I was.
Don't even worry about it.
Yeah, I really
Great
apologize.
to see you, though. I'm so glad you made it on.
For me too, to see you guys, it helps me a lot. So I'm really glad.
I am as well. So,
Great.
Kathryn, Jack, Jim, thanks for joining us tonight, and may the force be with you.
And also with you.
They were Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit.